Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bergeson and Campbell and the ACTA Group's webinar, What to Expect When You Really Don't Know What to Expect in Chemicals Policy and Regulation and on Capitol Hill. I'm Lynn Bergeson. I am so pleased to be your moderator today for this 1-hour webinar featuring the best possible subject matter experts on the subjects that we're going to discuss. Jim Aidala, Mark Washko, our two government affairs experts here at Bergeson and Campbell in the ACTA Group, and of course, Dr. Rich Engler, our director of chemistry and all-around Tosca genius. Right, Rich? Full biographical statements are available in the Zoom resources portal on your Zoom desktop there, so feel free to take a peek. Now, everything that we are going to discuss in the about 58 minutes that we have, and then some, is explained in much more detail in our 2025 forecast document. You can see the cover here and the table of contents, at least part of it. This 120-page document is prepared by our global team of subject matter experts and gives our best professional judgment in forecasting what to expect in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, South America, and elsewhere in the world. The link to the forecast is also in the Zoom resources portal, along with a very helpful and up-to-date TSCA litigation at a glance document. There it is there. We prepared this and completed it yesterday for your further information after the webinar, because there is so much TSCA litigation going on right now. It's kind of hard to keep track. You will also find in your resources section a copy of the slides that were distributed earlier today, a 2025 congressional calendar, and our public policy and regulation practice area description for your further information. Now, as for the agenda for our very short webinar today, we're going to focus chiefly on the legislative outlook, TSCA and FIFRA developments, because we really wanted the bulk of our discussion to revolve around a question and answer session with our esteemed subject matter experts. Many of you submitted questions well in advance of this webinar, and as a result, we've kind of taken those questions and reformulated them into a series of questions that I will ask our panelists. We've tried to address as many of the questions as we possibly could. We know there will be additional questions coming in during the course of the webinar. We will also try to address those also, but as is our practice, if we are unable to address all questions, we will prepare answers in writing and send them to all of the webinar registrants as soon as possible, usually a day or two later. So with that, as I said on our agenda, we're going to take a peek at the legislative outlook with Mark Washko, and then go to TSCA and then FIFRA, and then open it up to Q&A. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. So Jim and I are going to provide a high-level overview of what and how of expected congressional action in the 119th Congress, ending with a look at specific chemical, pesticide, and science issues. So setting the stage, the first 100 days, which we're in now when the 119th Congress convened on January 3rd, the first 100 days for the Trump administration will commence a week from yesterday on the 20th. And that's typically been a marker for how people measure presidents, at least since FDR, how much they can get done in the first 3.5 months or so. But before we can start talking about that, I just wanted to set the stage for what Congress looks like and what we can expect. For right now, there's been talk of the Republican trifecta. Republicans will have the White House in a week. They control both the House and Senate, albeit with narrow majorities. And that's going to come into play as well. The Republicans took control of the Senate, have a 53 to 47 seat majority. And in the House, the margin is 219 to 215. But that's actually going to shrink in about a week when 2 more members are going to resign. That'll give the Republicans a 217 to 215 majority, meaning that if one Republican decides to vote on a bill with Democrats, it will not pass, keeping in mind the House votes strictly on majority. So in addition, there's been a good deal of turnover since the last Congress too. We have 9 new senators, 4 Democrats and 5 Republicans, 63 new representatives, And that number will actually go to 66 by the time we get to April with special elections to fill the seat for Matt Gaetz, who resigned, and 2 members who will resign to go into the Trump administration. So that's the overview. Now, what's Congress going to plan on doing in the first half of this year, maybe this year? There are the high-level issues that President-elect Trump campaigned on, as well as several Republican priorities that were left over from the 118th Congress. For those of you taking notes, the first issue, these aren't necessarily in specific order, but these are the high priorities. Immigration and border issues, something that President-elect Trump campaigned on. Taxes and extending the 2017 tax cuts. Regulatory relief, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the Congressional Review Act in a few minutes. Also, trade and tariffs. We've heard a lot about trade and tariffs. A few important leftover items, or I'll say carryover items from the 118th Congress, not the least of which is the Farm Bill, which Jim will talk about in a few minutes. Also, energy and permitting issues, and then we get to government funding, which I'll call it the 3-headed monster of currently the government's funded through a continuing resolution which expires in March, and then we have the debt ceiling and DOGE. And I think, Jim, I'll hand it over to you to talk a little bit about the government funding as we move into the next step.
Well, yeah, government funding is obviously going to be a big issue, and we're going to talk about it in and out of a lot of the things in the next hour. And on all these issues, we're going to talk about, because if there really is a serious attempt to cut trillions from the debt, which is unlikely, but even, quote, a mere cut of, a couple hundred million can make a noise. And so, for example, on the first days of the now Speaker Johnson, in the first days after he became speaker in the last session, one of the first bills that was on the floor and did pass, it was approved by the House of Representatives, was a bill to cut EPA's budget by 40%. Now, it's not clear what that will mean for this year, this session of Congress and all, but any of the proposals to do serious budget cutting will have an impact on morale, will have an impact on just even scaring the staff in whatever way you want to say those words. And fears of things may be much greater than the actual impact, or at the end of the day, but even being fearful of having your office moved, reconsolidated, eliminated. What's that mean if my department is eliminated? Frankly, it just means it gets jumbled up among the other agencies because you still have laws that need to be implemented. But the fear for a lot of rank and file will be, well, does this mean I may have to move, get a new job, have a new position? As a young bureaucrat, I started out as a GS4, as a summer intern in government many years ago. And the two things you care about most are your salary and your office. Now with remote work, the office is a little different, but you do care about your salary and your position in the hierarchy. So that goes not just for government employees, it goes for everybody. But those kinds of fears are going to be an issue, and then directly affect EPA programs, and especially, for example, the money available for OCSPP, pesticides and toxic chemical reviews. They're a little bit different than some of the other programs at EPA. You need to get products approved, or else they don't get to market. And that means that big budget cuts or even small budget cuts can have a big impact. I think I'm going to turn it back to you for a second there, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So now that we've put out there the issues that Congress is going to face, and we'll focus on especially in 2025, there's the how are they going to do it? The two main ways that you've got regular order, which is you always hear Congress say we want regular order, which means there's a committee process and then it goes to the floor of the House or Senate for votes. And Congress always say they want to do that. The problem is legislating is hard. It takes time. And sometimes there isn't either the patience or the will or the ability to pass something that takes time. As I mentioned, presidents want to show accomplishments early on in their term, and so does Congress. So there is a legislative tool called reconciliation, budget reconciliation, which can be used on matters of taxes and spending, but it's limited to that. And it can address the debt ceiling. And you're already hearing talk about whether there'll be one reconciliation bill or two. One certainty is there will be a reconciliation bill, and it will address the priorities from the campaign that we had already mentioned. But they can't do policy issues. It has to be think of it as terms of like how it affects money. So with that, I also wanted to talk about not everything can be handled through reconciliation. So other things that we were going to talk about, Farm Bill, TSCA reform, et cetera, will go through regular order. And what that means, even though there's a Republican trifecta, Democrats have a role. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as we go through. I'll just, before we get into the role for the minority party, which has one, even though on paper they're not in charge, just want to talk about the new, how Congress is going to act with the new members, and with new members come new staff. Right now, the Senate, Senator Thune is the new Republican leader and the majority leader, replacing Senator McConnell, who was the Republican leader for quite a long time. In addition, all the Senate committees are now chaired by Republicans, so that's going to be a new staffing thing. And on the House side, you've got 6 new committee chairs and 4 Democratic leaders of committees, including, for our purposes, the House Energy and Commerce Committee has a new chairman, Brett Guthrie from Kentucky, who's going to lead that. So he's getting his staff all settled. So with the new staffing, and also on the minority side, I should say, EPW has a new ranking Democrat as well, with the retirement of Senator Carper. Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island will be the new Democratic leader on EPW. And so as these committees, what you have to think about, Congress is moving and trying to do things already. They're holding confirmation hearings starting today. But getting committee staff in place and getting committee agendas rolling is really important. So this is all going on in the background. And Jim, I'll hand it back to you to talk about the role of minorities, minority party in the courts.
Sure. And well, 2 things on that. One is on the minority side in the House, to be blunt, as in a summary, it just really sucks. I mean, the House is really everything's majority. So if you don't have the majority, although as Mark indicated, being so close, that's a little bit different than in years past when if the Speaker had an 18 or 35 seat majority on their side. That said, you do have some opportunities, and in the Senate, of course, with the filibuster still being preserved, as far as we know so far, but for confirmations, then each senator is obviously very important in the great tradition of in the Senate, where it seems like nothing can get done without at least everybody agreeing in some broad sense, i.e., you can even proceed to the floor with unanimous consent and things like that. But that's a whole different set of lectures by a whole bunch of other people. But that's the inside baseball of House and Senate rules. That said, still as a minority party, you have some tools. You have people appear at witnesses. You can have the General Accountability Office do some investigating. You can have IG reports to be talking about. You can have various folks that raise issues, whether it be investigative journalism or investigations by stakeholders, so-called investigations, or just an assessment by people, and bring those to those members and raise those issues at hearings and things. The bigger action is probably going to take, and that's in the House side. In the Senate side, you get a little more autonomy per se, just again because each senator's got a little more power per se on at least blocking things, and that's a non-trivial power, as we've seen, and unfortunately can often lead to gridlock over the years, in the recent years. The states are probably where you're going to see much more action. You're going to have Democratic-led states or Democratic AGs, Democratic governors, things like that, where they'll file litigation as a state challenging some of the activities of the other parties' administration. It's expected here now as a tool from the point of view of not having the trifecta, as Mark indicated. And then also just general litigation. You're going to have state houses and state officials take action. You're going to have challenges in the courts. You're going to have private entities. You're going to have a lot of certainly an expectation in environmental matters of a lot of NGO groups, environmental advocacy groups, and others challenging the work of the government under the new administration. It doesn't mean, too, at the same time, that the some of the stakeholders of quote industry folks challenging regulations and things, seeking even greater regulatory relief or whatever phrase, or just challenging because they don't feel the action being proposed is authorized under the law. We're not trying to have the legal seminar here. Another one you can get into. Secondly, is whether there's a lot of implication for the removal or changing, if at a minimum, Chevron deference. I think there we have some questions came up on that. We may get into that later. But Chevron deference alone, it doesn't mean you don't have deference to agencies per se, because they're still there writing the regulations and doing some other things. But that may lead to further and different kinds of court challenges over the next few years. I think that's it on being in the minority. It's not a fun place to be, but that's what you got. And state and legal other entities just challenging the actions of the administration is expected. The last thing would be states, if they're really controlled by the other party, by the Democrats, it would mean that they may have new initiatives. Clearly, there's a brewing fight, probably starting very soon, on electric vehicles and California requirements and things like that. It doesn't mean other states can have initiatives, and it may be the places where you see more initiatives, especially in the environmental space for green energy and so forth. But not just in the high profile issues, just across the board, you may see more environmental initiatives being attempting to be implemented at the state, even regardless of the party dynamic, but just simply to show that, proof of concept, if you will, that ideas and challenges, and there's a way to do more the green energy transition, as well as greater protections for water, public planning on housing policies and things like that. So that's the general thing. And the point is the Democrats are going to be trying to, if you will, hit them where they ain't. Since you don't have the trifecta, you got to have other avenues to try and do some work. I think it's back to you now.
So it is, and looking at the time, we're going to touch on a couple of the issues, specific issues that are coming up. And I will also say, putting in a shameless plug here, as we only have 15 minutes to start off here, we'll be doing a deeper dive. Both Jim and I and Rich Engler have separate podcasts coming up. The release dates, I believe, are in your meeting materials, but we're going to do deeper dives on Congress and the agencies and what to expect on some of these policies. So if we don't go as deep as you'd like here, there is more information coming. And also stay tuned and check out the public policy and regulation blog as well. We'll put some additional information there. But on the issues, talked about the Congressional Review Act. Jim has already touched on review of agency actions. The CRA, as it's called, can be used to undo regulations that have been passed within a certain time frame. Without getting into all the details right now, the CRA is a rather blunt tool. It takes away a regulation that has been passed, but within a certain amount of time period. Congress has 60 days of session to use it. And I'll just say there's talk about undoing lots of regulations, regulatory review. Back in 2017, the Republicans introduced 67 resolutions of disapproval, as they're called. That year's important. That was the first year of President Trump's first administration. Of those 67 resolutions, 16 were enacted. So 16 times under President Trump before were regulations from the Obama presidency overturned. Only 2 other times had it been used. The CRA was used successfully in the 107th Congress, 2001, and also 3 times by President Biden. So we'll see how effective and how active Republicans in Congress are in reusing the Congressional Review Act in the coming months. Stay tuned. On other chemical issues, just going to touch on it really fast, but the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, or CFATs, that expired. They have been expired. I do not see them coming back. And especially since one senator especially has stood in opposition to it. Now that the Republicans control the Senate, I don't see that happening. And TSCA, thankfully, as a lobbyist, one of the things you have to fight for is to generate interest in legislating. Well, the fees under the TSCA program expire at the end of the fiscal year 2026, September 30 in 2026. So Congress must act to renew those fees. And that also presents an opportunity to seek additional changes to TSCA and the reforms that were enacted 8 years ago under the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act. So there's an opportunity, and we'll see what happens when Congress goes to renew those fees. I'll toss it back to Jim for pesticide issues.
Yeah, I'll close on this, which is I'll be talking about ESA and PREA a little bit later, so I don't need to talk about that now. The Farm Bill, since this is the Congress session of our discussion this morning, the Farm Bill previously, first of all, it's expired. It's been sort of renewed for 1 year at a time for a couple of years now. The Farm Bill will happen, quote unquote. Two things about it. It'll be a little different with under Republican control. Senator Stabenow, formerly the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, basically gave an indication, somewhat unsubtly, that she did not really feel good about seeing the word pesticide in a Farm Bill. So that meant that the potential for some additions or subtractions were relatively small. That is gone now, both because she doesn't have party control of the committee and she's retired. So there's even a different minority ranking under the Democrats, Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota. The chairman is Mr. Bozeman from Arkansas, and at least there may be some discussion of some pesticide issues in the Farm Bill. It's a question of whether you'd really take on the big controversial things like a Endangered Species Act in any way, shape, or form, or quote, simpler things like some clarification of the uniformity of labeling, of what a state is allowed to say about a pesticide and some other things on their label and things like that. But those are, again, sort of the to be determined, and you'll see a big sign of that coming in what the majority in both houses produces as a Farm Bill. You'll see a template for seeing some potential for that. And last but not least, is it a small or large opportunity? The Farm Bill is a medium opportunity. Again, much more than it was, but it's not going to be a heavy heavy document about pesticide type issues. The other thing about the Farm Bill, the major fight in Congress is going to be between spending less on the so-called feeding programs, food stamps and other related kinds of things, versus some desiring to have less spending in general. But then if you have less spending in a Farm Bill, it may mean cutting some of the subsidies or whatever else, however they're arranged and called and described, for farmers. And so there's that big trade-off. We want to have less money in the Farm Bill, but hold it. We have to get our share for the feeding programs from the Democrats' point of view. And we want to protect the kind of farm subsidies or enhance them in some ways, because the farm economy this year and the last couple of years has not been the greatest. So what's that mean? And that's not even talking about tariffs, because one of the first things that often happens at the beginning, the earliest parts of a tariff war or a trade war, if you will, is heading off some of the agricultural exports, which our farm economy depends on to some extent. And so tariffs on farm goods from America may be part of the retaliation for tariffs we put on other countries. So stay tuned on that one. And even though that's not a direct pesticide issue, it's a farming issue, and one that'll come up in the Farm Bill, could affect pesticides just by way of sales and things like that. And just stay tuned. Mark, I think we're done, but back to you, or back to Rich, back to somebody.
So what do we expect for TSCA at OPPT there's a number of litigation.
Rich, you're not coming in very clearly with your
How's that? Is that better?
Much better.
So you've got the list of risk of litigation that's ongoing. All the current risk management rules are now in court. So we'll have to see how those play out. The asbestos and methylene chloride, a little bit more mature. The carbon tet, the trichloroethylene, and PERC are relatively recent. So those are very early. In terms of the risk evaluations and prioritization, the 1,4-dioxane formaldehyde are final risk evaluations. Those are not rules. I expect the incoming administration will take a close look at those, basically pull them back, take a look, do a do-over. There's little barrier to the incoming administration redoing those final risk evaluations. The prioritizations will continue. So we've got EPA's indicated the 5 already for prioritization. In 2025, those will move forward for risk evaluation. And then the next set for prioritization is coming on quickly behind those. and that's going to have to proceed. I think EPA will stick with their plan of doing 5 per year. They've got an obligation to review new chemicals and to do these timely. So we hope to see a cadence that OPPT is going to be able to move with going forward. There'll probably be a short slowdown anytime there's an administration transition. There's friction as people come and go, and getting the incoming political folks up to speed, and then we'll start to see things come out again. But at the staff level, until we see really significant budget cuts, we don't see a real reduction in the ongoing work. New chemicals, I don't see a big change. We didn't see a big change from Trump to Biden in terms of new chemicals. The pace fell off a little bit. Some of that was change of priorities, and but we've seen a pickup in 2024. So we haven't gotten back to where we were in 2017, 2018, but we have seen improvement over the last couple of years. EPA under the Trump administration was issuing orders or SNRs on about 88% of PMNs. That's up to about 92%, but that's not a big difference. We're still talking about 90% of PMNs are getting regulations, and we don't expect that to change absent litigation or legislative change. I think the new chemicals process is fairly well baked in these days. PFAS, I think, will also be relatively steady state. So the 8A7 reporting rule, I don't think that's it's outside of the Congressional Review Act range. So for Congress to undo it, it'd have to be some pretty prompt legislative action. I don't expect that to happen. And for the administration to undo it, it would require rulemaking. And given that the opening of the reporting period this summer, I think that would be pretty accelerated rulemaking. So I don't expect to see a change in the 8A7 rule. The 8D reporting rule is even more accelerated. The reporting deadline is in March. It would boggle my mind if that was subject to the Congressional Review Act. If that's going to be reversed, it's probably going to have to be through someone filing suit, seeking a stay, and then having the EPA seek remand so that they can redo the rule. Absent that, I expect the 8D reporting deadline to come and for things to proceed from there. TSCA's legislative action is, as Mark mentioned, it seems that there is likely to be legislative action in this Congress, at least for the fees. Whether there may be other changes, I think it depends on the priorities of Congress and the administration. I think institutionally, we would be surprised if there weren't some other changes, but time's going to tell to see what those are and how big a priority it's going to be for Congress. Jim, do you have any thoughts on FIFRA or on OPPT before we go over to FIFRA? Jim, you're on mute.
You don't want to hear all my paper shuffling in the meantime. But anyway, the upshot there is simply both TSCA and FIFRA, as I said before, have these programs where, right, if they don't have people, if they don't have staff, if they don't have budget, et cetera, to do the approvals, then that's a problem. And that's a different critter than most other programs at EPA. And so when I know I'm about to talk about PREA a little bit, and on PREA, okay, the pesticide industry actually affirmatively lobbies to get more funds, to get Congress to pay its share. It's a little bit different than the toxics fee program, but we need to have that baseline funding, among other things. We'd even like to see it increased, or other things to get EPA to spend more money on this effort. And the money's just not there, if you will, and that leads to budget shortfalls for contractors, to staff shortages and things like that. So I think that's perhaps a segue to pesticides. Is that okay with you, Rich?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, so let's talk officially about pesticides, and just trying to do it in a few minutes for now, because two things. One is, I think, as Mark mentioned, we're going to have a separate pesticide webinar, and I think sometime in the next 2 weeks. So and that date was announced in some of the materials you're having. And so take a look at that, and that'll be a much deeper dive than what I'm going to do now, which is going to be very short. Priya basically is hurt by again, as I just referenced, and Rich's question about the Congress not providing its quote share of in federal monies, as well as the general, whatever you think about the efficiencies of government bureaucracy and other kinds of things. Not to sound like Mr. Musk anyway, but the whole point is simply that there are very much missed deadlines. It's very frustrating to all stakeholders, especially registrants who have submitted things, and there's a real need to say this needs to get done. We thought we were able to plan around that deadline, and EPA misses it in one way or the other, basically by saying, "Oh, sorry, we have to extend your deadline," and you don't really have much choice at the end of the day. Now, is that going to change anytime soon? Probably not, given the budget outlook. And again, as part of that part of EPA is the kind of collateral damage to the larger image of EPA generally among the Republican caucus. Again, generally speaking, as I said, I referenced to a bill where they were cutting EPA's budget as a whole by 40%. So that is not good. But there may be now a desire and more of a receptive audience at EPA to, okay, so let's just assume we're not going to have enough budget, however you want to define those words. What can we do? What are some new ideas? Are there any things we can do to come up with newer ideas to help facilitate moving the process along? Can more upfront work be done by companies, by whatever it is, earlier and clearer communication? These are ideas that have been tried in the past and have been developed in the past, but then how can we even do them even in greater ways or more effective ways? ESA, now I'm going to try and summarize the Endangered Species Act FIFRA interaction in about a minute and a half, which is going to be real tough. But fundamentally, EPA has made very much progress in the last 4 years. The baseline is pretty low, given the previous 20 or 40, depending on how you want to count. But it is a real impressive achievement on the one hand. On the other hand, what they've done is develop strategies to try and avoid and minimize pesticide exposure to threatened and endangered species. That's the whole ballgame, right? At the same time, there's been much greater, again, with a low baseline, of greater cooperation with the services, the sister agencies that are actually in charge for, shall we say, blessing the ESA particular decisions and the ESA approach. They're the ones that list the species, for example. And at the last issue then becomes, well, can it work? And it kind of works on paper, the strategies that EPA has outlined for avoidance and minimization, as they call it. There's a menu of options that the growers would have to select from and have to meet a minimum number of points you would get for various mitigation strategies. Again, you could spend 4 hours describing all this and still have a vague understanding. So at the same time, again, we'll talk about that more in the next couple of weeks at our FIFRA webinar. But the bottom line is these mitigation options are going to be very complex to follow, or certainly a fear that they're going to be so complex that they're going to be difficult, if not impossible, to follow. Or then enforcement questions come up, who and how to be enforced. And the key point is, this is the way I summarize it, EPA is going to need to thread a needle that balances enough of ESA protections through the process and requirements to basically satisfy a judge, because there's been so much litigation historically on these issues, that a judge who's been skeptical, the court in general, not a particular judge, there may be those, but just the court in general has been skeptical that it's not meeting the requirements of the ESA. And so that's going to be, can we both have it, complex enough and effective enough, but yet not so complex that it can't be done and can't be understood by growers who have to, apply these restrictions to their operations. My last point that I'll talk about is just staffing, morale, budget, DOGE, Project 2025, Schedule F, all kinds of things. I know we're going to get into that, I think, in the Q&A, but basically, real or not, whether it be Schedule F as an executive order, budget hacking, not just cuts, but hacking away, trying to cut $2 trillion of the budget, moving the agency. Let's move EPA to Omaha or somewhere. I have no idea what they may come up with, or just even pieces of EPA being threatened to move. You know, OPP is pretty agricultural. Let's move them to somewhere in the Midwest. Anyway, all that just causes tumult and fear, and frankly, most staff won't really be affected by that, probably. But easy for me to say I don't work at EPA anymore. And last but not least, talking about appointees and confirmations and things, the question of leadership and what level of distrust. The last Trump administration, there was pretty significant distrust between leadership and the career staff. That leads to everything from just there's, lack of cooperation in some professional sense, as well as pretty readily claims, at least claims of science integrity issues where the political people are not following the science. Well, that gets into this issue of where do you draw the line? The science says X and the staff is recommending Y, and then the political decision, because elections have consequences, they are the leadership. And where those lines are appropriate and if they're crossed or not crossed becomes an issue, was a big issue under Mr. Trump's first term, and I predict will be a fairly significant issue in the coming term. I think, Lynn, we're turning back to you to actually lead the official Q&A discussion.
That would be right, Jim. Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for excellent presentations. We tried to be very general in the PowerPoint segment of our webinar. Now we're going to kind of drill down with some synthesized questions that many of you offered us. And we really appreciate the questions. Thank you for asking so many really good ones. I'm going to pitch the first one. Many of the questions had common themes relating to procedural and process issues that our clients and the new EPA will be dealing with, and then substantive issues. We've already talked a little bit about procedural and process issues. We know the incoming administration wishes very much to have a smaller bureaucratic footprint. DOJ is talking about some pretty heroic cuts in the federal budget. First question, and Jim, perhaps you can address this, is what are your best estimates regarding just brain drain and attrition generally in the federal workforce? There's been quite a lot of discussion in the trade press and media generally relating to concerns that the incoming administration may not be as science-based in its decision-making, causing people to look for the door. That may be exaggerated, but what's your best guess in that regard, Jim? And on substantive issues, many of us in the TSCA world are pretty much expecting some do-overs, right? Just as the Biden administration did a lot of do-overs of the Trump administration risk evaluation process and other science policy decisions relating to Lautenberg implementation. Are we expecting that, Rich, in the forthcoming weeks and months ahead? So Jim, you first, and then Rich, and then Mark.
Sure. Well, again, I sort of touched on that, what my last remarks on, quote, pesticides, because it applies across generally to EPA. But let's assume that there's a Schedule F. Again, it's an executive order. I don't think it's going to hold up over time. You could pass a law. You've got the majority, the trifecta and all that. And I think that's what we would really need to do, something that significant. SES, invented by Jimmy Carter, so it was a Democratic idea per se, does allow you to move some of the mid-level, mid-managers, middle-level managers and things. And that's an underused tool from a certain view. So again, that does make it a little more of a threat there, but it just increases that sense, not just of unease, that's fine. Not every job is easy, right? But simply that there's a fear of what may happen. With all due respect to any of us that have any job in any space on any issue, we think is very important, right? That's what we spend our every day on, right? Our professional lives. It must be so important. Well, I bet you those guys up there, wherever that is, must be thinking they'll come after me. Well, frankly, most people in the government are below the waterline. Most decisions, there's 5,000 risk management decisions made by the pesticide program every year, or probably more now. 5,000. How many can you name or of any kind of controversy or speculative debate and things like that? So I mean, most people at EPA, both I think in toxics and pesticides, are going to be below a level that they really need to be concerned about. But it won't feel that way, number one. Number two, with the threat to get rid of remote work, that's a big important change post-COVID, and that could make a significant difference. And those who can leave or can retire will do so in order to avoid some of these headaches and or just,
Yeah.
undesirable work conditions. And then lastly, it affects recruitment. I mean, how do you go and recruit people to go join EPA to help do PMN reviews, to help do pesticide processing and things, registration processing, if you've got this sort of, well, we don't know where the office may be, we don't know what your work conditions will be, and your budget, your salaries are probably going to be frozen, if not cut, if we could do it. So that's sort of some of this whole issue set and the complexity of mixing everything with DOGE, Schedule F, budget cuts in general. And I'm just mad at EPA, and EPA does bad science. And if that's the working conditions and operating environment, it's that will have an impact on the workforce.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Agreed. Thank
turning
you,
over to
John.
Rich.
Yeah, just following up on that point, at the the below the waterline idea. I mean, back in my day, there was almost no change from administration to administration in the review of new chemicals. We did see some change from Trump 1 to Biden, and will we see much of a change from Biden to Trump 2? I don't know. It doesn't seem likely, but I think to Jim's point about people departing, you'll have a cadre of people who are just don't want to deal with it, and they'll depart for one reason or another. I don't know that it'll be draconian, but it's important, I think, for stakeholders to step up and tell the incoming administration and the new Congress, look, this part of EPA does need to be properly resourced. There are statutory obligations for existing reviews, both registrations and for existing chemicals reviews, but also the OCSPP is the gateway for new chemical technologies, and industry and the stakeholder community in general needs the office to function, well, needs to meet both the scientific and the legal standards. And so what does that mean? And educating the incoming folks about what that means.
What about the do-over stuff, Rich?
The risk evaluations, I think, will be done over
All of them?
Anything. Well, the two final risk evaluations, probably the draft risk evaluations. There's essentially built-in do-over because they're receiving comments, and so they can revise those proposed risk evaluations. The proposed risk management rule, like for pigment by 29, that can essentially be redone in response to comments. The final risk management rules, as I mentioned, the older ones, asbestos and methylene chloride, those are going to have to be undone. I think by either through new rulemaking, but more likely through the courts. And honestly, I'm not sure that it's in industry's best interest to seek remand of those. There's some key terms, extent necessary in particular, and the whole chemical approach. Those are two key things that it may actually be beneficial to get those answered from a legal standpoint. The TCE, PERC, and Carbon TET, those, I don't think they're going to be Congressional Review Act, but they're in court now, so those might be more amenable to a remand and a redo, especially if we get court decisions on methylene chloride and asbestos. So it's going to be a mix of things. I don't think Congressional Review Act is going to be really used much in the TSCA context. If anything, maybe the formaldehyde final risk evaluation, if someone makes an argument that that's amenable to CRA. I mean, in all the CRA actions, the only one that's related to EPA is waters of the U.S. So that's the only EPA action that's been reversed on the Congressional Review Act. So I just don't think it's likely this time around.
Mark, you might have a thought or two on that, because a lot of people are betting big on CRA. I don't think it's as relevant in our space. I think WOTUS is something that people are probably looking at. What's your take?
No, I agree on the CRA. Just to give people some idea, the Republicans have about 60 rules they're looking at right now for potential CRA action, including HFC phase out that's something else in the EPA space, but also there's a crypto rule that was finalized. Crypto is not my space. I read about it, I understand. But there's also a safety standard for nursing pillows. I mean, it runs the gamut of any kind of regulation that's been finalized. But I don't think it's going to be a wholesale, introduction of things, because keep in mind, there's a narrow time frame to do this. Members of Congress have to expend political capital, which means have to explain it easily to members and get it on board. And some chemical issues just tend to be a little bit complex and somewhat arcane. It's not that something you're going to go on the news about and people are going to be like, wow, that's great. On a high level, they'll get it, but I think it becomes more difficult in specific chemical space. But I would like to pick up on one thing, if I can, on this topic, and it was just picking up on something Rich mentioned about how EPA functions, and it's something I'm going to go back to from the 2010 elections, 2011, when Republicans came in, all about here's what we're going to do to EPA, and it took a lot of work by chemical industry lobbyists to explain that EPA was the gateway to commerce for chemicals, and so doing away with EPA was not helping people who are creating the products that are the building blocks from everything from autos to technology, iPhones, et cetera. And we need the agency to work well. It was rough in some interesting meetings, but I think the education process that needs to go on, and I think looking at how that's evolved in the past 8 years, and at Project 2025, it talks about how OPPTS has to work more efficiently. And so if we can pick up on the E and DOGE, maybe there's an opportunity to make the EPA process work so that we can continue to promote innovation and not stifle it.
Right. And Mark, that was partly back to the PREA derivative, which is what are some ideas, not to get rid of it. You can't do that because you would get rid of your approvals, kind of what you're saying about the amends and other things. But how can you make it better? What are some things that would do it? Are there some even, God forbid, investments, if you will? IT systems in the government are always bad. If Mr. Musk gets that down, far into details, he's going to be beyond horrified, just because it's the latest in Windows 95 technology kind of thing in many cases, believe it or not. And so, those are the kind of things that are going to matter about if you really are serious about making it efficient, as you just said, versus just cut, slash, and burn, if you will. And Lynn, I have to say, you keep talking about do-overs, and I'm twitching because it's the same as Opposite Day, SpongeBob, season 1.
You and SpongeBob, Jim.
Yes. Season 1, episode 9. Please watch it for reference. It's Opposite Day. And the serious part of that is, I won't go into the SpongeBob reference too much more, but when Trump Trump ran especially on, I'm going to reverse everything Obama did.
Right.
And then Biden ran on, in some measure, at least environmentally, I'm going to undo things Trump did. And now Trump's doing it again. And that's just sort of the state of Washington now, unfortunately. And hopefully, I don't know, hopefully something's going to break the fever or do something to make the system at least a little more efficient, not just the sort of back and forth thing. But again, the back and forth thing is important because there's important issues underneath all that.
True that. Well, stepping back from the granularity of TSCA and FIFRA, one commenter raised a really interesting question, and that is many companies over the last 4 or 5 years have invested significantly in environmental justice initiatives, sustainability, clean energy, and other, to use a Trump term, woke initiatives. How is or should senior management be adjusting to the new probable normal under the Trump administration while not betraying the many public commitments to precisely these objectives that seemingly don't align with the new administration? Jim, you want to take a shot?
Sure. Well, I mean, these are the kind of things, it's not just marketing, if you will, but I mean, how many companies, I know you're going to ask this question, and what's your fundamental mission statement? Did no one woke up in the morning and said, hey, let's go contaminate the planet today, right? In our companies. Similarly, by the way, for EPA employees, they don't wake up in the morning and say, hey, let's go be stupid today. Sometimes it happens anyway, but whatever. The point is that let's get back to the basics. And so you can call it ESG, but various companies certainly have these mission statements, corporate commitments and things like that are fundamentally that they can be sort of tinkered with to call it ESG under the old concepts. But instead, fundamentally, you're saying we're committed to science, we're committed to effective products, we're committed to following the law. That's the basis of what all that stuff was before we got into this nomenclature of woke versus not so awake or whatever the equivalent is. And so to me, it's like go back to your basic mission statements, and they're probably similar, and you can tinker with the rhetoric and some of that in order to fit the modern discussion, but it's not fundamental, shouldn't be that much fundamentally different to me. Now, again, you were trying to be, I'm sure even our small company, we're going to be nice to our employees. We're not going to discriminate. We're going to do all these great things, and we more or less do them. I'll leave that at separate. But anyway, those are not going to be that different now. Me calling it ESG, calling it woke, calling it whatever, and that's how it should be, because your company from the start hopefully hasn't been that different with or without such a dressing, a rhetoric about rhetorical dressing around it.
Okay, great. Rich, Mark, anything to add? It's a nice entree to the next question,
Yeah, let's go. Given the time, let's go on.
which is what role do you see for probable detractors of the new administration? NGOs, public health organizations, blue states, more progressive states and related cohorts. Are states likely to ramp up considerably chemical initiatives similar to what we experienced, shortly before Lautenberg was implemented? What's your take, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, I do expect there to be opportunities, or that organizations, states especially, are going to look to fill their perceived gaps. We've seen that even during the Biden administration. One of the drivers, attendees might remember, one of the drivers for Lautenberg was preemption of state action. Given the paucity of final agency rules under TSCA existing chemicals, there's not a lot of state preemption right now. So states may step up and try to go after things that EPA is not working on. We saw that 6 ppd actually started in California and Washington before EPA took it up under Section 6. So I do expect some of that to continue, and I expect the lawsuits to continue from both sides. We're still, Lynn, we've been talking 8.5 years now about getting at what some of these key legislative terms mean, and we still don't have answers. So TSCA is still a relatively new, or TSCA reform is still relatively new in terms of it's a litigation history. So the litigation I expect to continue.
Agreed. Mark, Jim, anything to add? I'm going to pivot to PFAS then. PFAS was sprinkled all over the questions. What's in your crystal ball collectively? CERCLA listing rollbacks, liability waivers. Rich, you've already indicated that you think TSCA 8A7 will be largely untouched. Maybe some carve-outs for fluoropolymers, rescinding the categorical ineligibility for LVE and Lorexes, which came out just last month, with which we have vigorous disagreement. What do any of you gentlemen wish to offer?
Well, there's a whole variety of issues, just as there's a whole variety of PFAS. 8A7, and I saw one of the questions was related to, might 8A7 get narrowed? I mean, to change 8A7 is going to be a significant effort on EPA's part. They could do it. There is probably sufficient time to get something done, but it is going to be heroic to get that done. So I don't expect that to happen. I think it depends on how much people jump up and down. I mean, the opportunity to litigate on that is long past, and it's well outside the CRA window. So it would require rulemaking, and I just don't see it happening. Other PFAS, the CERCLA, the water issues, those are also, to a certain extent, the different varying degrees are being litigated. Part of it is the underlying science, the best available science, or did they just pick a number that they, the lowest number they could find? Those are not necessarily the same thing. So we might see revisiting on those. PFAS under TSCA, I expect we'll continue to see test orders, not in a particularly vigorous manner. There's a lot. It's a lot of work. Test orders and reviewing all that data is a lot of work on EPA's part as well. So I'm not sure we'll see a big uptick on that. We might see finally EPA try to take some action under Section 6 for some of the more notorious longer chain PFAS. That might be something that we see, especially for those things that are largely out of commerce at this point. But adding PFAS to TRI, that's statutory now, so there's not a lot of opportunity to undo that.
Right, 205 and counting.
Yep.
Yeah,
Rich, Jim?
two comments. One would be just, I keep forgetting to say this, but my friends at EPA say that this administration, Biden administration, still in force today, had really tried to work at certain things to get done that could be out of reach of CRA, separate from what could be on the list, what might be on the list, and things like that. And they calculated that back to try and get things that became final rules before June, certainly July 1st. So that's one way to mark what even would be potentially on the agenda, as Mark said, about, everybody wants a whole bunch of things on there, but some small fraction of that become actually subject to potential action under CRA, number one. The other thing, Mark, I'm going to turn to you to either any of these things, PFAS, Congress, or whatever, but I just want to point out something I promised my colleagues I'd say for all of us, and that is that, remember, at 12:01 on January 20, Mr. Trump is a lame duck. And what I mean by that is yes, the next presidential race begins. We could all guess about how many people are going to be candidates, senators and other people, governors, and that affects back to state actions and other things. People have to figure out their platforms, figure out what's the avenue they think they might be getting, some more public attention, national attention, and things like that. So that'll be part of the dynamic too on A, quote, Trump administration response, B, PFAS or anything else. What's the lowest number we can come? Is there a number below 1 part per something that I could impose in my state to show that I'm the big protector of X and things like that? So I mean that kidding aside about it, that starts now, and we'll continue. Whatever you think of that about our system, but that'll be going on. Mark,
Well, I'm just
finish
gonna
up.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat something I've said before, and I'll continue to say, but legislating is hard. That's why Congress is looking to use reconciliation instead of regular order to try and get something across the finish line. Legislating on complex environmental matters is very difficult. It took about 10 years to get the TSCA reforms done. It took about 10 years to get the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990 done. That takes many years, many meetings. And what we have now as a dynamic is you've also have Republican chairmen that are limited to 6-year terms. And so if you start something now, what that really does is it incentivizes people to get something done in the short term. On PFAS, there's been PFAS legislation for multiple Congresses, and it's usually addressed through the Defense Authorization Act or NDAA. But the big nut to crack is really the cleanup. It's going to cost a lot. How's it going to be paid for? It's one thing for Congress or states to ban things, but the big nut is DOD's got a huge outlay. They've got a lot of contamination, airports, other places. How are you going to pay for the cleanup? And how to do that? There was an attempt to show how difficult it is. There was an attempt at bipartisan legislation last Congress in the Senate Environment Committee, and that proved rather challenging. But what you need to do is get people around a table and start trying to hash it out, saying, we don't want to bat this around as an issue. We want to solve it. And our legislative process doesn't get you to the perfect answer, but it gets you to a good answer. But you need to start at some point. So I would just say it's a difficult nut to crack, and it would take some time, but I think it's worth doing. But I think the incentives are a little bit misaligned in terms of how long people have their jobs and what they can accomplish during that time frame.
Rich, anything you want to add?
Nope.
Well, we have about 2 minutes, so I'm going to ask each of you to close out your comments with what word or two or points might you want to make advising our clients if they are wanting to brief their managements in preparing for the new administration? What are the 2 or 5 points that you would expect them to make in addressing all of the changes that we've talked about and the many that we didn't have time to address? Are there big constellation of trends that management should be focusing on right now? I think, Mark, you've already indicated one of them, educating Congress on some of this more subtle aspects of what it is we do. because there are a lot of new faces in Congress right now. And my big fear is that everything that Congress people learned during Lautenberg might have dissipated some, given many of the new faces in the House and Senate now. But one small point, what do each of you wish to offer?
I'm just going to go first here. I think it's critical on industry to step up and make sure that EPA is doing it right. We need to help with technical expertise. We need to provide a legal framework. What we want durable, reproducible, predictable policies. EPA has a statutory obligation to do this, and it's on everybody. It's on all stakeholders to make sure that EPA is doing it right.
Thanks, Rich.
Yeah, my 30 seconds would be for an industry perspective, industry group, don't overreach. And what I mean by that is don't just assume deregulatory emphasis or rhetoric. It just means you don't have to do anything. Use the time constructively. What are there's legitimate criticism from the right and the left about what EPA does or doesn't do. So, you've got a different set of allies, chairman, all the stuff we've talked about. Make use of it.
So I'll just go with saying, and Lynn already mentioned the point that there are so many new members of Congress just this year, but going back to 2016 when the Lautenberg amendments were enacted, I think get me the exact percentage, but I think it's over 3/4 of Congress is new since then. So it really is incumbent upon, companies educate, meet with your representatives, your senators, tell them what's going on, and don't just come to them with problems. They can be your champions too. They want to celebrate your victories. If you've got, a 10-year safety record with no accidents at your plant, let them know. I mean, companies have gotten resolutions on the floor to recognize people. Let them recognize the good things. They want to talk about you and not just hear about problems, although they're there to help you with problems too. But reach out to your elected officials and also reach out to the new administration too, because there's a lot of new people that are new to government and, need to know if they come from corporate backgrounds, they don't know how government works, and, you can help them understand that and what the levers and tools are that they can use to be helpful as well. I just engage early, engage often, and don't assume knowledge on behalf of your elected officials or your agency people. Go in and explain to them how what you do matters. And especially in the chemical industry, one piece of advice I got from a member of Congress a couple of years ago was, don't talk to me about long chemical names. Talk to me about what that goes into so I can understand that, it's not just this chemical, but it affects your car, your phone, your clothing, your something, your crops. Explain it in those terms. And I think we in industry can do a better job about doing that as well. But engage early, engage often, and don't assume that people know everything you're talking about. And keep it simple.
We are officially out of time. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining. For those of you that offered questions, if we didn't get to them, we will. Don't despair. Want to thank our wonderful panelists for all of their wisdom and expertise. And end by just saying we wish everyone listening for a happy, healthy new year. And we look forward to working with you on all of these important issues. So thanks so much. Take care.